what an average day campaigning looks like for you.
Well, so, the last week has been kind of on the down low. I'm in California in my house. And so, to be honest, it really depends on what state ballots you're on. And California is one of the state ballots that I'm on where there'll be primary voting on Super Tuesday in about 6 to 8 weeks. And so I spent a lot of time in my home state where people know me because I know I can get the most amount of votes here. However, when I'm in some of the smaller states like New Hampshire or Iowa, then I'm out in the campaign trail and waking up at hotels, getting up, having breakfast, going out, meeting people. Hopefully I have an event that can be put on for me or just joining an event, but it's much more on the road kind of thing. But when I'm in California, a lot of it is just, from behind a computer and meeting friends here in my hometown and just trying to rally support and also donations.
Right. And it sounds like you have a lot to do. So what do you do to cope with all of the external demands on you? What do you do to enhance your cognitive performance?
Well, when you're on the campaign, it's a lot easier when you're not so involved with something to worry about performance, to worry about how to be your best and things like that. I mean, normally I might take some nootropics. Generally, I would try to run every day or swim at least one day, at least a half hour of exercise every day. I try to read and maybe just go for walks and take it easy. Honestly, on the campaign, there's none of that because everything else becomes a blur. And I'm not saying that's necessarily good for my health or good for my focusing ability, but it's just the nature of the beast is when you're involved, it's 24/7 and you just kind of got to run with it. I'm a lot healthier when I'm not in a campaign.
I see. So let's dive straight into your policies that you want to implement. Why do you think that all drugs should be legalized?
Well, I'm a firm believer in kind of a libertarian philosophy where adults, at least adults, need to be able to do whatever they want to do with their bodies whenever they want, and including harm it. And ultimately, that would bring forth a philosophy where, well, drugs should then be legal. Why are we spending $1 trillion on the war on drugs? I mean, if we're going to spend any government money on trying to prohibit drugs, let's prohibit the usage of negative experiences with drugs. Let's spend money on rehabilitation, sort of like they do in Portugal, rather than what we're doing here, which is, just putting everybody in jail. I mean, our prisons are filled with nonviolent drug offenders. And that doesn't help anybody. So I just think the simplest way to do a drug policy is just to legalize everything. And then if we have government money that we want to spend on taking care of our citizens, let's spend it on rehabilitation, or let's spend it on trying to get people not to take the kinds of drugs that ruin their lives. But broadly speaking, I just believe drugs are good. I like drugs. I've taken them in the past, not really anymore. But for experimental reasons, I walk around my journal, and all these other things. I think drugs are an important part of mind expansion and thinking of things differently. And I understand that other people have a problem with it, and I'm sorry about that. And I think we need to try to curtail that problem. But I don't think criminalizing something like it is helped. I mean, clearly the evidence is not in favor of the criminalization of drugs as helping. I mean, we need to do something different. That's end the war on drugs, legalize drugs, and spend the money on rehabilitation, and that people don't have bad experiences with it.
I think that's very important that we start to look at these compounds in a more scientific manner so that we can help people use them for good rather than the current state in which people just use them however they have been told by their friends it may be good for them to get a short-term reward. Well, how do you think that one can legalize all drugs? You mentioned rehabilitation, but can you expand on how are you going to ensure that people do not get addicted to hard drugs?
Well, I'm not going to ensure that they're not going to be addicted. They probably will be. But yeah. I don't know if the numbers are that dramatically different just because it's free. I think people are going to get addicted to drugs, whether they're, whether they try them or not, whether they're legal or not. I think if we spent more money on trying to rehabilitate people instead of trying to criminalize it, I think you would, like Portugal, have 10 or 15% less problem drug users than we have, than we have now. When Portugal implemented their system of legalizing drugs kind of across the board, the percentages dropped by about 15 or 20% over the last 15 years. And I think that's about what would happen here is like, we've had prohibition on a lot of things in America, alcohol, whatever. It doesn't necessarily stop the abuse of it. It doesn't necessarily just puts it to the black market. And, I mean, people still continue to do things, whether they're good or bad for them. So money is often spent better on trying to fix people and trying to fix their issues rather than trying to penalize people for having those issues in the first place.
Right. And rehabilitation is, of course, very important. But what do you think that you, as a president of the United States, if you become that, can do to prevent people from?
Well, I think if you really want to try to prevent people from doing bad things, then you need sort of almost like propaganda campaigns, really to inform them that this is bad. I mean, there's no question that if you have an addictive personality and you do heroin, then, heroin's going to affect your life. And if you're married, you probably might lose your job, and then you might, eventually get divorced, and, your spouse kicks you onto the curb, and you're bad for your children. I mean, I think if you have enough propaganda out there to support that drugs are dangerous, that would help people. And that's maybe where money is better spent. But again, it's not, I just feel as sort of a libertarian minded person, it's not my job to stand in the way of what people want to do to themselves and their bodies. It's my job to allow a government that stands up for the people's rights, including the ability to harm themselves. That doesn't mean that I want people to harm themselves, and it doesn't mean that I wouldn't spend government money on trying to make it so people don't harm themselves. But ultimately, I'm somebody who believes more in the rights of the individual than in curtailing those rights. And so I would rather spend government dollars on, trying to inform people on what's the best path to take. And I don't generally think usage of heroin is the best path to take for anyone to do, unless they're under very controlled circumstances where they may just use it for experimental reasons a little bit. But, I can't see, or, we use it for medicinal purposes. But there's very few instances where, hard drugs like that are probably good for people.
Right. Why do you think that there are bans on drugs in the first place, and other radical sciences as well, such as genetic editing?
Sure, I think there's a very strong conservative population of older people, and they tend to be wealthier, and they tend to make a lot of the decisions in governments, and they tend to be afraid of new things that come out. Any kind of new invention that came out over the last 500 years, or before that as well, millenniums, has been often looked at skeptically at first. Sometimes people were burned at the stake when they had good ideas, good scientific ideas. Then they get sort of accepted by some of the fringe societal elements, because all of a sudden people say, hey, wait a sec, this invention, is good, and then ultimately society embraces them when everyone says, oh, wow, having a smartphone is really a good thing, or, using anesthesia when a surgery is a good thing. I mean, there are countless examples. Even when credit cards first came out, everybody was so worried that, oh no, now we're going to be tracked. Now we're going to know all these different things about us. Yeah, well, being tracked in society has actually helped increase safety overall. And people are so freaked out about surveillance and privacy without realizing that a lot of these issues that scare them actually make them safer and have better lives. But that's the nature of innovation, is that we've always ostracized the people who come up with brand new inventions at first, especially those transformative ones. And then the older generation starts to accept them when they can make money off them and when they're not so freaked out about them. So I think, the same thing is with drugs. Drugs are very useful from a medicinal point of view and also for mind expansion capabilities. But, there are also downsides. People see homeless people on the street using them all the time. They associate the drug use with being homeless, but it may be something very different, maybe mental disease or something like that. So, these kind of connections especially of the older generation. They're the ones who'd like to ban everything and put moratoriums on everything first. I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, as president, I wouldn't allow that. I would say, look, we welcome innovation. We welcome brand new ideas. I mean, we'll use some caution when looking at it, but I want an open and free society, and we want as many innovations as possible.
Right. I think I read on your website that citizens treating their body well influences the U.S. positively overall, even from an economic standpoint, and people being healthy is good for the economy. If you let people use drugs and take risks, aren't those two policies slightly contradictory?
Yes, but I mean, again, I have to let people take risks because I think, that's the nature. A good leader is not going to try to, jail his citizens and say, you can't do anything fun with your life, can't do anything exciting, can't do anything experimental. I mean, if people are grown-ups, if they're an adult and they want to do something, they should be able to do it. And if it causes overwhelming harm to society, I would probably put a stop to it. If it causes overwhelming harm to just individuals, then I'm not sure it's necessary to put a stop to if these are thinking individuals that understand what's happening. Now, the argument with drug use and, is usually made that these people don't know what's going on. But, I mean, most of the people I know that use drugs, they seem to be pretty aware of it. They, I don't know. I mean, I understand some people overdose and do terrible things with drugs, and obviously I'd like to stop that. But I'm not sure it's necessary to completely get in the way of people's freedoms, which is exactly what you're doing with the drug war. So I think overwhelmingly the drug war has failed in terms of not only protecting people. Like I said, if you want to protect people, you need to protect them through information and letting them make their own decisions. We are all, when it comes to adults, that's just how I believe people should be handled. Let them be free to make their own conscious decisions.
So you think that educating people will make them more capable to make good decisions regarding their health as well?
Yes, totally. I also think mass surveillance and things like that are going to help make society better. I think one of the problems with, overdosing and people that, kind of lose lose their consciousness and really go down a bad place with drugs and, their jobs and then their wives and their families and maybe overdose. It's partly because we don't see that happening as a society. And it kind of happens, and then we find them, and then they're either dead or they're just gone. They're just never going to recover in terms of being like lost all their money. I think if we can stop people, after maybe a few attempts of using drugs or whatever, because we know, like a family member can see them, or a family member knows, or an AI knows. This gets into a more difficult situation, but controversial in the idea that I support kind of a wide surveillance state where everyone is watched to some degree for their own benefits. And if we could find people doing bad things, we might be able to stop them ahead of time and send a family member or send a police over and say, hey, do you really want to shoot up with heroin one more time? You might die. And if that was to happen, then all of a sudden we would have, a society where maybe people don't do such dumb things to their bodies. And I think already we're coming to a place when, because of instant communication and, connection with everybody all around us, we're able to keep better tabs on our children, on our parents, on our friends, and things like that. And I'm sure that that's already dramatically helped save and protect a lot of people because you have instant ability to help someone. But, I'm not saying that's the solution here. I think the real solution is education, but there are other technological solutions that can help drug overdoses and things like that dramatically. And, as we get into it, you may have read the article I wrote for Vice, but, there was a few years ago when I wrote it, there are some people, drug lords, that are interested in brain chips and different types of, I guess, devices that would implement different drug states, but not through anything plant-based, but through stimuli as they're kind of doing right now with Alzheimer's and dementia, in terms of some of the brain implants they're putting into medical patients to stop these diseases. Well, I mean, within 10 years, we're almost certainly going to have implants that can do the same thing. In fact, we already have a few different headset devices out in the market that are supposed to calm you, help you meditate, and different things like that. It's called neurofeedback and whatnot. And so there's a very real chance that with, you know, the drug world will change from just being something plant-based and substance-based to something that's internal, that's done through a program. It sounds very science fiction, but I assure you, where I live in Silicon Valley, there are hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into these technologies, and they're already experimenting with them on people.
Right. Do you think that it is a viable option to enhance people's cognition and learning in order to make it easier for them to learn about the risks of drugs, for example?
Yes. And, you know, this is the thing with these kind of like brain implants or headsets that might actually give you these highs, is that they would be, you know, determined. They would have a point when they say, okay, you've gotten too high, it's becoming dangerous. We're not going to take you to an overdose level. Or, you know, they would signal to 911 or the emergency crews, hey, we have a person here who's, you know, doing this too much or something. And unlike drugs, which is if you're in your basement shooting up heroin, they just find you dead if you've done too much. And I think that's where this new age of drugs could be really interesting, beyond the fact that probably because of AI mechanisms and the way the brain works, we're going to find new highs, new ways of understanding our consciousness that allows us to feel different sensations, maybe sensations that make us much smarter. Maybe it's not necessarily like a high like heroin where you feel ecstatic or euphoric, but you feel really smart. Your memory is improved and things like this. And beyond that, then we get to an age when, you know, implants or headsets allow you to download information and give you stimuli such that you can retain that stuff. We've already done this with rats, where we would implant memories in rats. So rats know in a maze where to go to get the food without ever having been in that maze. So within the next 10 and definitely 15 years, you're going to hear so much on this idea of, you know, essentially Neuralink, brain implants, things like that, that are either inside your brain or on a headset that directly use brainwave technology, EEG technology, that really kind of allow us to kind of tap into the frontiers of consciousness and do the same thing drugs do, but through, you know, machine and microprocessors and things like that. And I think it's a great future. It's probably going to be a lot safer. The big worry is people hacking your brain. But like I said, there are drug lords that are investing in in companies that would be specializing in this. This is absolutely the future. It's not a question of whether it's going to come. It's a question of when does it get here? And like I said, you know, there are now maybe a dozen companies that are working on this stuff. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg recently bought some kind of brain implant company too. So, I mean, this is here. It's just going to, when's it going to be kind of like, when can you and I do our conversation here, this interview through our heads? And then 15, 20 years, I'd suspect.